A man walks into a photography studio in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, loses his voice completely, and wakes up describing medical cures he shouldn't know anything about. That moment in 1901 would split Edgar Cayce's life into before and after. Before, he was nobody. After, he became the sleeping prophet whose 14,000 documented readings still baffle scientists today. This is the story of how a man with an 8th grade education diagnosed illnesses he'd never studied, prescribed treatments that didn't exist yet, and described past lives in civilizations no archaeologist had discovered. But we're starting at the beginning, with a boy in Christian County, Kentucky, who talked to invisible people. March 18th, 1877. The farmhouse sat outside Hopkinsville, surrounded by tobacco fields that stretched toward a horizon most residents would never cross. Leslie Cayce, a farmer and justice of the peace, probably didn't think much about the birth of his 5th child. Another mouth to feed, another pair of hands for the fields. Eventually, Edgar's childhood was unremarkable, except for one detail he insisted on his entire life. He saw things. Not vague shapes or shadows, full conversations with people who weren't there. His grandfather, Thomas Jefferson Cayce, had drowned when Edgar was young. The boy claimed they still talked regularly. Not metaphorically, actually talked. His parents dismissed it as imagination. Rural Kentucky in the 1880s had little patience for peculiarity. You worked the land, attended church, married young, and died without fuss. Visions didn't fit the pattern. School was worse. Edgar struggled with everything except spelling, which he dominated effortlessly. Math confounded him. History bored him. His teacher considered him slow, possibly simple-minded. He spent more time staring out windows than focusing on lessons. Then came the night that changed everything. Edgar was 13, frustrated after another failed attempt to memorize his spelling lesson. His father had drilled him for hours. Nothing stuck. He went to bed defeated, the book under his pillow, because he had nowhere else to put it. He woke knowing every word, not just his lesson, the entire book. He could visualize each page, recall every definition, spell words he'd never consciously studied. His father tested him relentlessly the next morning, convinced the boy was playing some trick. Edgar spelled every word perfectly, then described what appeared on each page of the textbook. It wasn't memorization, it was something else entirely. He experimented. Any book placed under his pillow while he slept became accessible to him. Not the way you remember something you studied, the way you remember your own name. Complete, instant, permanent access. He could visualize the pages, read them in his mind, extract any information at will. His schoolwork transformed overnight. The slow student became inexplicably brilliant, at least in subjects where books mattered. But Edgar kept the method private. Even at 13, he understood that explaining, "I sleep on books," wouldn't go well. The ability was useful, but isolating. He couldn't control it, he couldn't explain it, and he definitely couldn't turn it off. By 16, Edgar had left school. 8th grade was standard for farm boys, and his family needed help with crops more than they needed a scholar. He worked alongside his father, planting tobacco, tending livestock, doing the 1,000 tasks that keep a farm alive. But the visions continued. He saw his grandfather. He saw other figures he couldn't identify. Sometimes he knew things before they happened. Small things, meaningless things. Where a lost tool would be found. When rain was coming. Who would visit that afternoon? His mother Carrie encouraged his religious studies. If the boy was peculiar, better he be peculiarly devoted to God than peculiarly devoted to anything else. Edgar threw himself into Bible reading with the same intensity he'd once applied to sleeping on textbooks. He memorized vast passages. He could quote scripture for hours. He decided he wanted to become a minister. His father was skeptical. Ministers needed education, connections, denominational approval. Farm boys from Christian County didn't simply announce they'd be preachers and have it happen. But Edgar persisted, spending every spare moment studying religious texts and practicing sermons in the tobacco barn. Then at 18, everything fell apart. He took a job at a bookstore in Hopkinsville. Decent work, respectable position, steady income. He lasted months before the pattern shifted again. He moved to a dry goods store. Then he tried his hand at insurance sales. Nothing stuck. He drifted between positions, competent enough, but never quite fitting anywhere. What he really wanted was to heal people. The impulse came from somewhere deep, something beyond ambition or career planning. When neighbours fell ill, Edgar felt pulled toward them. He wanted to help but had no training, no medical knowledge, no authority to act. He was just a farm boy who'd slept on spelling books and saw dead relatives. At 21, he found photography. The camera was relatively new technology in rural Kentucky. Most people had never been photographed. Edgar apprenticed with a local photographer, learning to mix chemicals, operate equipment, pose subjects, develop plates. The work suited him. It was precise, creative, independent. He was good at it. For 3 years, life stabilized. He worked. He saved money. He fell in love with Gertrude Evans, a local girl whose family approved of the photography trade. They planned marriage. Edgar imagined a normal future, the kind his parents had lived. A shop, a wife, children, quiet years of ordinary contentment. Then his voice disappeared. It started gradually. Hoarseness. After a long day, difficulty projecting. He assumed he'd strained something, but it worsened. His voice dropped to a whisper, then vanished completely. Days passed, weeks, nothing helped. Doctors examined him, found no physical damage, prescribed rest and various tonics. The silence continued. Without his voice, photography became difficult. He couldn't direct subjects, couldn't negotiate prices, couldn't conduct business. His employer grew impatient. Edgar grew desperate. Months accumulated. He tried every doctor within travelling distance. Some blamed nerves, others suggested psychological causes. None offered solutions that worked. He was 24 years old, voiceless, watching his future collapse. That's when the hypnotist arrived. Hart the Laugh King. That's what the posters called him. A travelling entertainer who'd made a circuit through Kentucky, performing comedy hypnosis shows. Volunteers from the audience would be hypnotized into believing they were chickens or opera singers or whatever got laughs. Someone suggested Edgar try hypnosis for his voice condition. Nothing else had worked. He was desperate enough to attempt anything. Hart agreed to help, outside his regular performances. He put Edgar under easily. The young man was a remarkably receptive subject, dropping into trance states deeper than Hart typically encountered. Under hypnosis, Edgar's voice returned completely. He could speak normally, clearly, without any impediment. Then he woke up. The voice disappeared again instantly. They tried repeatedly. Same result. Under hypnosis, perfect speech, awake, complete silence. It was as if 2 different Edgar Cayces existed, one functional and one broken, separated by the barrier of consciousness. Hart was baffled. He'd never encountered anything similar. The condition was clearly psychological, but the mechanism made no sense. Why would hypnosis restore function that waking consciousness couldn't access? After several failed sessions, Hart left town. His tour schedule couldn't accommodate extended therapeutic work. Edgar returned to his silent frustration, more confused than before. Hypnosis worked but didn't work. His voice existed but didn't exist. 6 months later, another hypnotist tried. Al Lane wasn't an entertainer. He was a man with some medical training and a strong interest in hypnotic healing. He'd heard about Edgar's case and thought he might help. Lane's approach differed from Hart's. Instead of commanding Edgar's voice to return, he asked Edgar himself what was wrong. Under hypnosis, he prompted Edgar to examine his own condition and describe what he found. Edgar's voice came back immediately, but it wasn't Edgar speaking, not exactly. The voice was Edgar's, but the vocabulary wasn't. The knowledge wasn't. Under Lane's hypnotic direction, Edgar described his condition in precise medical terminology. He identified the problem as partial paralysis of the vocal cords caused by psychological factors. He prescribed specific treatment, targeted suggestion during the hypnotic state to restore normal circulation and nerve function to the affected area. Lane followed the instructions exactly as the sleeping Edgar dictated them. Edgar's throat flushed red as blood flow increased to the area. The session continued for 20 minutes, with the entranced Edgar monitoring his own progress and adjusting the treatment. When he woke, his voice was normal, completely, permanently normal. He could speak, he could laugh, he could shout. The 18 months of silence ended in a single afternoon because he diagnosed and treated himself while unconscious. Lane was stunned. Edgar was terrified. What had just happened? Who had been speaking through Edgar's vocal cords? Where had that medical knowledge originated? Edgar had never studied anatomy or physiology. He'd barely finished 8th grade. Yet under hypnosis, he demonstrated expertise that rivaled trained physicians. Lane had an idea. If Edgar could diagnose himself, maybe he could diagnose others. Edgar refused initially. The entire experience unnerved him. Speaking while unconscious, accessing information he shouldn't possess, healing through methods he didn't understand. It felt dangerous. It felt wrong. It definitely felt beyond anything his religious upbringing had prepared him for. But Lane persisted. He was suffering from a severe stomach condition that doctors hadn't successfully treated. Would Edgar at least try, just once, for a friend? Edgar finally agreed to one session. Just one. To repay Lane for restoring his voice. Then he'd return to photography and pretend none of this had happened. Lane put Edgar into the same deep trance. This time, instead of directing Edgar toward his own condition, Lane described his stomach problems and asked for help. The voice that emerged from Edgar was calm, authoritative, completely unlike his normal speech patterns. It described Lane's condition in detail, identifying problems that doctors had missed. It outlined a treatment protocol involving dietary changes, specific exercises, and herbal remedies. It spoke for 30 minutes, covering every aspect of Lane's illness with systematic precision. Edgar woke with no memory of anything he'd said. Lane wrote down every word. The treatment worked. Within weeks, Lane's condition improved dramatically. Within months, he was healthier than he'd been in years. And he told everyone who would listen about the sleeping diagnostician who'd cured him. Word spread through Hopkinsville. People started approaching Edgar. Just small requests at first. A reading for a sick child, advice for a chronic condition. Edgar resisted, but each time someone asked, Lane reminded him of his moral obligation. If he could help people and chose not to, wasn't that worse than never having the ability at all? Edgar agreed to a few more sessions, then a few more. Each time he'd lie down, enter a trance state, and speak with authority about conditions he knew nothing about consciously. Each time, he'd wake with no memory of what he'd said. And each time, the treatments he prescribed while sleeping worked with impossible frequency. The pattern was impossible to ignore. A man with barely an 8th grade education was prescribing treatments that worked when trained physicians had failed. And he was doing it while completely unconscious. But here's what made it even stranger. Edgar didn't just diagnose, he explained. In detail that would make medical textbooks look like children's stories. During these readings, as they came to be called, Edgar would describe the exact state of organs he'd never seen. He'd identify circulation problems, nerve damage, chemical imbalances. He'd use medical terminology he'd never studied. Latin names for conditions, technical descriptions of physiological processes, all delivered in that same calm, authoritative voice that bore no resemblance to his waking personality. And then he'd wake up and remember absolutely nothing. This wasn't parlour trick hypnosis. This wasn't showmanship. Edgar Cayce was genuinely unconscious during these sessions, and something or someone else was speaking through him. The question that haunted Edgar was simple and terrifying. What was the source? His religious upbringing offered several possibilities, none of them comforting. Was this divine gift? Demonic deception? Something else entirely that Christianity hadn't prepared him for? Edgar spent hours praying, searching scripture, seeking guidance from his pastor. The answers he found only deepened his confusion, because the readings weren't just accurate, they were compassionate. They showed genuine concern for the suffering of others. They prescribed treatments aimed at healing, never harm. Whatever was speaking through Edgar seemed to care about people. Could something evil produce such consistently good results? Edgar didn't know, but people kept coming, and Lane kept encouraging him to help just one more person. Just one more. By 1901, Edgar was conducting readings regularly, though he tried to keep it quiet. He'd close his photography studio, lie down on the couch, and Lane would guide him into trance. Someone seeking help would be present, describing their condition. Edgar would respond with detailed medical advice. Then came the case that made secrecy impossible. A young girl named Aimee Dietrich had been sick for 3 years. Doctors called it a mysterious ailment of the mind. She suffered seizures, behavioural changes, personality shifts. Her parents had exhausted every medical option available in Kentucky. Someone told them about the sleeping photographer who gave medical readings. Desperate people try desperate things. Edgar agreed to see her. During the reading, his unconscious voice described something completely unexpected. This wasn't a mental illness, it was physical. Years earlier, the girl had fallen getting off a streetcar, striking her spine near the base of her skull. The impact had been minor, easily forgotten, but it had created a subtle injury that gradually worsened, affecting her nervous system in ways that manifested as psychological symptoms. The treatment was equally specific. Adjust the spine in a particular way, apply specific manual pressure to the affected vertebrae, restore normal alignment, and the symptoms would resolve. Her parents found an osteopath willing to try. He followed Edgar's instructions exactly. Within weeks, Aimee Dietrich was recovering. Within months, she was completely healthy. The mysterious ailment that had baffled every physician who examined her vanished because a photographer, while sleeping, had identified an injury no one else had considered relevant. The story hit the newspapers. Not local papers, major newspapers. The New York Times ran a feature. Medical journals published cautious inquiries. Skeptics and believers alike wanted to know more about this impossible phenomenon in rural Kentucky. Edgar's quiet life ended. His photography business became secondary to an ability he didn't understand and couldn't control while conscious. People arrived from other states. Letters poured in requesting readings. Reporters camped outside his studio. Medical professionals demanded demonstrations. And Edgar was terrified, not of exposure, of responsibility. Every reading potentially affected someone's life or death. What if he was wrong? What if whatever spoke through him made a mistake? What if this gift, if that's what it was, suddenly stopped working and someone died following his advice? He wanted to quit, to return to photography, to normalcy, to a life that made sense, but how do you walk away from something that heals people? How do you refuse help when you're apparently capable of providing it? The answer came from an unexpected source: the medical establishment itself. Dr. Wesley Ketchum was a respected physician who'd heard about Edgar and decided to investigate. He attended a reading, expecting to expose a fraud. Instead, he witnessed Edgar describe a patient's condition with accuracy that stunned him. The unconscious photographer detailed internal problems that Ketchum had diagnosed through extensive examination and testing. Then Edgar prescribed a treatment that Ketchum himself had been considering but hadn't yet implemented. Ketchum became a believer. More than that, he became an advocate. He presented a paper about Edgar to the American Society of Clinical Research in 1910, describing the readings as a phenomenon worthy of serious medical investigation. The presentation created a firestorm. Some physicians dismissed it as quackery. Others demanded evidence. A few quietly admitted they'd seen similar cases but never reported them for fear of professional ridicule. The paper put Edgar Cayce on the map nationally, transforming him from a local curiosity into a subject of serious debate. But it also revealed something that would change the trajectory of Edgar's life. The readings weren't limited to medical diagnosis. During one session, someone asked Edgar while he was in trance about a missing person. The voice responded with specific details about the person's location. The information was accurate. Another reading addressed a business question. Again, accurate. The sleeping Edgar seemed capable of accessing information far beyond medical knowledge. This terrified Edgar more than the medical readings. If he could see inside bodies, that was strange but potentially explainable. Maybe some kind of heightened perception. But knowing things that happened miles away? That crossed into territory his religious background taught him to fear. He consulted his pastor, who suggested Edgar might be channeling spirits of the dead. This was necromancy. Forbidden by scripture, Edgar consulted another minister, who proposed these might be demonic entities pretending to be helpful to gain his trust. A third minister suggested God worked in mysterious ways and perhaps Edgar should simply trust the good fruits of his labour. 3 religious authorities, 3 completely different interpretations. 0 clarity about what was actually happening. Edgar decided to test it himself. He'd ask questions during readings that only he knew the answers to. Secret things, personal things. If the voice got them wrong, he'd know it was fabrication. If it got them right, he'd have to accept this was real, whatever it was. The voice answered every test question correctly. It knew things Edgar had never told another living soul. It described events from his childhood with perfect accuracy. It even corrected details Edgar himself misremembered, which were later verified by family members. Whatever was speaking through Edgar had access to information no human should possess. The readings continued, dozens per week by 1911. Edgar would lie on his couch, Gertrude taking notes, as Lane conducted the sessions. Each reading followed the same pattern. Deep trance, that authoritative voice, detailed information, complete amnesia upon waking. But something new began happening. The readings started mentioning concepts that made no sense to Edgar's conscious mind. They spoke about reincarnation, about souls having lived multiple lives, about karma and spiritual evolution, about purposes that extended far beyond a single lifetime. This was not Christianity. This was not anything Edgar had been taught to believe, and it was coming from his own mouth while he slept. He was devastated. He'd been raised to believe in one life, one judgment, one chance at salvation. Now his own readings suggested reality was far more complex, that souls returned again and again, learning lessons across multiple incarnations. That the Bible itself, properly understood, supported this view. Edgar seriously considered stopping altogether. If these readings contradicted his faith, how could they be from God? But if they weren't from God, how could they heal so effectively? The contradiction was tearing him apart. Gertrude offered a perspective that helped. Judge the tree by its fruit, she said. The readings helped people. They healed the sick. They brought comfort to the suffering. They never advised anyone to do harm. Whatever their source, their effects were consistently positive. Wasn't that what mattered? Edgar wasn't entirely convinced, but he continued, partly because he still didn't know how to refuse people who needed help, partly because he was beginning to suspect there was more to reality than his childhood religion had taught him, and partly because the readings themselves insisted they came from the same divine source he'd always believed in, just understood more completely than his limited human perspective allowed. The First World War brought a new dimension to his work. Families requested readings for soldiers overseas. Edgar would lie down, enter trance, and the voice would describe the soldier's current condition and location. Often the information arrived days before official military communications. Several families learned their sons had been wounded or killed through Edgar's readings before the War Department telegrams arrived. This raised an uncomfortable question. If Edgar could see across oceans while sleeping, what else might he perceive? The answer came gradually. People began asking about past events, about future possibilities, about the nature of consciousness itself. And the readings answered, expanding far beyond simple medical diagnosis into philosophy, metaphysics, and the structure of reality itself. Edgar found himself at the center of something much larger than he'd ever imagined. This wasn't just about healing bodies, it was about understanding existence, about the relationship between physical and spiritual, about humanity's place in a cosmos far stranger than most people suspected. By 1923, Edgar had given thousands of readings. His reputation had spread internationally. People wrote from Europe, from South America, from Asia. They didn't need to be physically present. Edgar could enter trance. Someone would provide a name and location, and he'd describe that person's condition as clearly as if they stood before him. Distance meant nothing. Time meant nothing. While unconscious, Edgar seemed to access information from anywhere, anywhen. His photography business had become a side project. His real work, his real purpose, was lying on a couch twice a day and allowing something beyond his conscious understanding to speak through him. He still didn't fully comprehend what was happening, but he'd accepted that it was happening, that it helped people, and that refusing this ability would be refusing his life's purpose. The readings had transformed from medical consultations into something approaching spiritual counseling. They discussed not just physical ailments, but emotional wounds, relationship problems, life purpose, and the soul's journey across multiple incarnations. They offered advice that was practical, compassionate, and rooted in a philosophy that synthesized Christianity, Eastern thought, and metaphysical concepts Edgar had never consciously studied. He was becoming famous. Not celebrity famous, not wealthy famous, but known. The sleeping prophet. The man who knew impossible things. Articles appeared in national publications. Books were written about him. Skeptics tried to debunk him and often became believers instead. Medical professionals who investigated expecting fraud found themselves unable to explain what they witnessed. And through it all, Edgar remained fundamentally the same. A simple man who'd wanted nothing more than to take photographs and raise a family, now serving as a channel for information that challenged everything he'd been taught to believe. He never claimed to understand it. He simply accepted it as his burden and his gift, helping whoever asked as best he could, trusting that whatever spoke through him knew more than he did about healing and truth. The question that haunted Edgar most wasn't whether the readings worked. By 1923, he'd seen too much evidence to doubt that. The question was what they revealed about the nature of reality itself. Because the sleeping voice didn't just diagnose illness, it discussed things Edgar had never studied, using terminology he'd never heard, referencing concepts that seemed to come from nowhere. It spoke about past lives, about karma and reincarnation, about the soul's journey through multiple physical incarnations, learning lessons, working through patterns, evolving towards some ultimate reunion with the divine. This terrified Edgar. He was a Sunday school teacher, a devout Christian, a man who'd built his entire worldview on the Bible as he understood it. And now something was speaking through him while he slept, contradicting fundamental doctrines he'd been taught since childhood. Reincarnation wasn't Christian, it was Eastern mysticism, heresy, the kind of thing good Baptists were supposed to reject outright. Yet here it was, emerging from his own mouth in trance after trance, explained with such detail and consistency, that he couldn't dismiss it as random nonsense. The readings described how souls chose their incarnations, selecting circumstances that would provide opportunities for growth. They explained physical ailments as manifestations of karmic patterns, spiritual debts from previous lifetimes working themselves out in the present body. They discussed Atlantis, ancient Egypt, lost civilizations and forgotten knowledge. They claimed Edgar himself had lived multiple previous lives, that his current abilities were skills he'd developed across centuries of existence. He wanted to reject it all, wanted to believe it was delusion or demonic deception. But the medical accuracy remained undeniable. The healings continued. People got better when they followed the reading's advice. How could something giving such beneficial practical information also be spreading spiritual falsehood? His wife Gertrude struggled with it too. She'd watched Edgar agonize over these contradictions, seen him wrestle with reconciling his faith and his gift. One evening, after a particularly troubling reading that discussed multiple incarnations, Edgar sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. "I don't know what to do, Gertrude. I don't know if I should continue." She sat beside him, choosing her words carefully. "What does the Bible say about judging a tree by its fruit?" "You know what it says. By their fruits ye shall know them." "And what fruit have these readings produced?" Edgar looked up. "Healing, help, people getting better when doctors gave up on them." "Then maybe," Gertrude said gently, "God is bigger than we thought. Maybe truth is bigger than what we learned in Sunday school." It wasn't a solution, it was an opening, a possibility that perhaps divine truth couldn't be contained in any single religious tradition, that maybe the readings were expanding rather than contradicting what he'd been taught. Edgar prayed about it constantly, searched scripture for guidance, read everything he could find about mysticism, philosophy, comparative religion. Slowly, painfully, he constructed a framework that could accommodate both his Christian faith and the broader cosmology the readings described. The Bible, he decided, contained essential truth, but not complete truth. Jesus' teachings about love, forgiveness, and spiritual transformation remained central. But perhaps the specific doctrines of any church were human interpretations of divine mystery, approximations rather than absolute statements. Perhaps reincarnation wasn't incompatible with Christianity. Perhaps it explained things the standard theology couldn't. Why innocent children suffered, why some people seemed to have innate talents or irrational fears, why Jesus said we must be born again. What if he meant literally? What if the soul's journey through multiple lives was part of God's plan for spiritual education? It was a radical reinterpretation, one that would have gotten him expelled from any Baptist church if he'd expressed it openly. So he didn't. He kept these evolving beliefs private, shared them only with close friends and family, continued teaching Sunday school with the same devotion he'd always shown. But internally, his understanding of existence was transforming. The readings continued to expand in scope. People asked about business decisions, relationship problems, life purpose. They asked about death and what came after, about the nature of time, consciousness, God, and the sleeping voice answered, constructing a comprehensive metaphysical system that addressed questions Edgar had never thought to ask. It taught that all souls are eternal, that we're spiritual beings having temporary physical experiences, that Earth is a school, physical life a classroom where souls learn lessons they couldn't learn in purely spiritual realms. It explains suffering not as divine punishment, but as challenge, opportunity, the resistance training that strengthens spiritual muscles. It described the universe as fundamentally mental, consciousness as primary, matter as secondary. Physical reality, the readings insisted, is thought made manifest, shaped by individual and collective consciousness into the forms we perceive. This wasn't idle philosophy. The readings connected these abstract concepts to practical living, showing how thoughts and attitudes directly influenced health, relationships, and circumstances. They emphasized personal responsibility. No one was victim to fate or circumstance. Every situation, the readings insisted, was either chosen by the soul before incarnation or created through the soul's own mental activity during life. This was empowering and terrifying. It meant Edgar and everyone else were architects of their own experience. That blaming God or luck or other people was refusing to accept the creative power inherent in consciousness itself. The readings also discussed what they called the Akashic Records, a kind of cosmic library containing the complete history of every soul's journey through all incarnations. When Edgar went into trance and accessed information about someone's past lives or future possibilities, he was supposedly reading from these records, perceiving patterns of cause and effect that spanned centuries. This explained how he could know things about people he'd never met, how he could describe events from their childhood, or predict likely futures based on current trajectories. He wasn't creating the information. He was accessing it from a source that existed independent of his conscious mind. Scientists became interested. Researchers from universities wanted to study him under controlled conditions. They'd bring sealed envelopes containing questions about medical cases Edgar knew nothing about. He'd enter trance, someone would open the envelope and read the question, and he'd provide detailed diagnoses and treatments without ever seeing the patient. The accuracy rate was disturbing. Not perfect, but far beyond chance, far beyond what any theory of cold reading or educated guessing could explain. Some investigators concluded fraud must be involved somehow. Others admitted they couldn't identify any deception, but remained skeptical anyway, unable to reconcile what they witnessed with their understanding of how reality worked. Edgar didn't care much about proving anything to skeptics. His concern was helping the people who came to him desperate, often after conventional medicine had failed them. A woman arrived from New York with a daughter who'd been diagnosed with incurable spinal tuberculosis. Doctors said the child had months to live. The reading prescribed a specific combination of osteopathic adjustments, dietary changes, and a compound Edgar had never heard of containing gold chloride. The family followed the instructions exactly. 6 months later, the girl was walking without pain. A year later, X-rays showed the tuberculosis completely gone. Stories like this accumulated. Children saved from death. Adults freed from decades of chronic pain. Conditions declared incurable by medicine responding to treatments the sleeping Edgar prescribed. Some treatments seemed absurd. The readings once recommended that someone suffering from psoriasis eat nothing but almonds for 3 days, then switch to a diet of raw vegetables and Jerusalem artichokes. Ridiculous, unscientific, yet it worked. Another time, for a case of epilepsy, the reading prescribed that the person carry a small piece of carbon steel in their pocket and take daily doses of a solution made from specific proportions of gold, silver, and copper. Pseudoscience. Except the seizures stopped. Edgar was often as baffled as anyone by what came through. He'd wake from readings and ask, "Did I really say that?" The stenographer would read back the transcript, and he'd shake his head in disbelief. The readings insisted there were laws governing health, consciousness, and spiritual development just as precise as the laws of physics. They simply weren't laws that conventional science had discovered yet. Energy followed thought. Like attracted like. What you focused on expanded. The body was a temple, responsive to both physical treatment and spiritual intention. Prayer worked not by changing God's mind, but by aligning consciousness with divine will, opening channels for healing force to flow. All of this contradicted the materialist worldview dominating early 20th century science. Matter was supposed to be fundamental, consciousness an epiphenomenon of brain chemistry. Souls and spirits and metaphysical forces were relics of pre-scientific thinking. Yet Edgar's readings operated from a completely different paradigm, one where consciousness was primary and matter secondary, where mind shaped reality rather than being shaped by it. By 1925, Edgar and Gertrude had moved to Virginia Beach. The readings themselves had suggested this location, indicating it would become the centre for the work Edgar was meant to do. They established a small office. A secretary named Gladys Davis joined them, a young woman who would devote her life to recording and preserving Edgar's readings. She'd eventually transcribe over 14,000 sessions, creating an archive that would outlive everyone involved. The work became more organised. Appointments were scheduled, records were kept. Follow-up reports tracked whether people improved after implementing the reading's advice. Edgar gave 2 readings most days, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. More than that exhausted him. The trance state, whatever it was, demanded enormous energy. He'd emerge from readings physically drained, sometimes sleeping for hours afterward. The content continued to expand beyond medicine. People asked about business ventures, and the readings would analyse the likely success or failure based on factors the conscious Edgar couldn't possibly know. They asked about lost objects, and the sleeping voice would describe exact locations. They asked about dreams, and the readings would interpret symbolic meanings with psychological insight that anticipated Freud and Jung's work by years. One of the most controversial aspects emerged when people started asking about the future, not just personal futures, but global events. The readings began making predictions. Some were vague, others startlingly specific. They predicted the stock market crash of 1929 months before it happened. They warned about coming world conflict before anyone used the phrase World War II. They described technological developments that wouldn't exist for decades. Television, computers, advances in medicine and transportation that seemed like pure fantasy in the 1920s. Edgar didn't like the prediction readings. They felt presumptuous, almost like playing God. But people kept asking, and the sleeping voice kept answering. Some predictions came true exactly as described. Others didn't, or hadn't yet, or were too ambiguous to verify. Critics pointed to failures as proof of fraud. Believers pointed to successes as proof of genuine prophetic ability. Edgar himself refused to claim anything. He was just the channel. Whatever came through came through. He didn't control it, didn't understand it, couldn't validate or invalidate it. What he could do was try to help. That remained his North Star through all the strangeness and controversy. If someone needed help and the readings could provide it, he'd give a reading. Money was always tight. Edgar charged modest fees, often gave free readings to those who couldn't pay. The work supported them barely, never made them wealthy. That wasn't the point. The point was service. Gertrude understood this. Gladys understood this. The small circle of supporters who'd gathered around Edgar's work understood this. They weren't building an empire or starting a cult. They were documenting something unprecedented. A man who could access information impossible to access through normal means, who could heal through methods science hadn't recognized, who seemed to bridge the gap between physical and spiritual realities. And Edgar, the simple photographer who'd never wanted to be special, who'd never sought fame or fortune, was just trying to do what he'd always done. Help whoever asked, trust that whatever spoke through him knew more than he did. Keep his faith despite the contradictions, love his family, teach his Sunday school class. Live as ordinary a life as possible, while serving as a conduit for the extraordinary. The year 1923 brought a crisis that would force Edgar to confront the strangest aspect of his gift yet. A wealthy printer named Arthur Lammers came to Dayton from his home in Ohio. He wasn't sick. He had no physical ailments requiring diagnosis or treatment. What Lammers wanted was something Edgar had never been asked to explore: philosophy. Lammers was obsessed with metaphysics, with ancient wisdom traditions, with questions about the nature of the soul and the universe. He'd studied Eastern religions, read the mystics, explored every spiritual text he could find, and he was convinced that Edgar's readings could access information that would answer the biggest questions humanity had ever asked. Edgar was uncomfortable with this from the start. His gift was for helping people heal, not for cosmic speculation. He was a Christian Sunday school teacher from rural Kentucky, not some New Age guru. The idea of using the readings for philosophical inquiry felt wrong, almost blasphemous. But Lammers was persistent, and he offered to fund the work properly. No more scraping by, no more choosing between paying rent and buying groceries. Just steady support, so Edgar could focus entirely on giving readings. Gertrude thought they should consider it. Gladys pointed out that helping people understand spiritual truths was still helping people. And Edgar, exhausted from years of financial struggle, finally agreed to try. The first philosophical reading took place in October 1923. What emerged would shatter Edgar's worldview and divide his supporters for decades to come. The sleeping voice began speaking about reincarnation. Not as a foreign concept from Eastern religions, but as fact, as the mechanism through which souls evolve across multiple lifetimes, learning lessons, balancing karma, progressing towards spiritual perfection. Edgar woke up horrified. He was a fundamentalist Christian. He believed in heaven and hell, salvation through Christ, the resurrection of the body. Reincarnation wasn't just foreign to his theology, it contradicted everything he'd been taught since childhood. He told Lammers there'd been a mistake. That couldn't be real information. Something had gone wrong with the reading. But Lammers was ecstatic. He'd suspected this truth for years, and now Edgar's readings were confirming it. He wanted more. He wanted to explore past lives, karma, the structure of spiritual evolution. Edgar refused at first, then reluctantly agreed to try one more reading, just to prove the first had been an error. The second reading doubled down. Past lives were real. Everyone had them. They shaped current circumstances, explained relationships, accounted for talents and struggles that seemed to have no origin in this lifetime. Edgar spiraled into crisis. How could his gift, which he'd always understood as coming from God, suddenly start teaching something his church considered heresy? Had the source changed? Had something dark taken over? Was the devil speaking through him now? He prayed constantly. He read scripture, searching for any hint that reincarnation might be compatible with Christianity. He found a few passages that could be interpreted that way if you squinted, but nothing definitive. The Bible he'd memorized as a child said nothing clear about souls returning to earth in new bodies. Gertrude watched her husband tear himself apart over this. She didn't care about reincarnation, one way or another. She cared that Edgar was suffering, that his faith was being tested in ways that might break him. Gladys took a more practical approach. She'd been documenting the readings for years now. She'd seen them heal people, predict events, describe conditions impossible for the conscious Edgar to know. Whatever the source was, it had proven reliable on thousands of verifiable claims. Why assume it was suddenly lying about this? The arguments went on for months. Edgar would decide to stop giving readings entirely. Then someone would write desperate for help with a medical condition, and he'd relent. He tried restricting himself to only health readings, but people kept asking philosophical questions, and the sleeping voice kept answering them. The reincarnation material kept coming. Not just vague statements, but detailed past life readings describing specific previous incarnations. A woman's current fear of water traced to drowning in Atlantis. A man's gift for music explained by lifetimes as a composer in Renaissance Italy. A child's instant connection with ancient Egypt linked to experiences as a temple priest thousands of years ago. Atlantis. That was another problem. The readings started talking about Atlantis as historical fact. Not myth, not legend, but an actual advanced civilization that had destroyed itself through misuse of technology 10,000 years before recorded history began. Edgar knew how this sounded. Reincarnation was at least a legitimate religious concept billions of people believed. But Atlantis? That was Plato's invention, a fictional story told to make a philosophical point. Every serious scholar knew it wasn't real. Yet the readings described it in extraordinary detail, its technology, its social structure, its final destruction, the dispersal of survivors to Egypt and South America, the hiding of records that would someday be discovered. Critics had a field day. This proved Edgar was a fraud, they said. Atlantis was fantasy, therefore everything else was fantasy too. The medical successes were coincidence or misdiagnosis. The verified predictions were either vague enough to fit any outcome or cherry-picked from failures nobody mentioned. Edgar's church community began pulling away. His Sunday school class dwindled. Fellow Christians who'd supported his healing work were now questioning whether he'd ever been working for God at all. The contradiction was impossible to resolve through logic. Either Edgar accepted that his gift had always been real, and therefore these new revelations were also real, requiring him to radically revise his religious beliefs, or he concluded that the whole thing had been delusion or deception from the start, which meant discarding 30 years of documented healing and verified information. He chose a middle path, though it satisfied no one. The readings themselves were genuine, he decided. The source was still divine, but his conscious understanding of theology had been incomplete. The Bible, interpreted through the lens of institutional Christianity, had lost certain truths that earlier Christians had known. Reincarnation wasn't heresy, it was forgotten doctrine. He found support for this in historical research. Early Christian groups like the Gnostics and certain church fathers had taught reincarnation before later councils declared it anathema. The concept had been edited out of Christianity for political reasons, not theological ones. It was a thin thread to cling to, but it let him continue the work without feeling he'd betrayed his faith. The readings themselves seemed unconcerned with Edgar's crisis. They continued answering whatever questions people asked, from mundane health problems to cosmic spiritual principles, with the same matter-of-fact tone. The sleeping voice never defended itself, never argued for its own credibility, never seemed aware that it was causing Edgar such anguish. Lammers funded the creation of a proper organisation. In 1925, they established the Association of National Investigators, later renamed the Association for Research and Enlightenment. It would document the readings systematically, organise the material by topic, and make the information available to researchers and interested parties. This meant leaving Dayton. Lammers convinced Edgar that the work needed to be in a place that could support it long term. After considering several options, they settled on Virginia Beach, a small resort town on the Atlantic coast. In September 1925, Edgar, Gertrude, and their sons packed up their lives again and moved to Virginia Beach. Edgar was 48 years old. He'd been giving readings for 33 years, and his work was about to enter its most productive and most controversial phase. Virginia Beach suited them. It was quiet, far enough from major cities to offer peace, but accessible enough for people to reach. The beach reminded Edgar of the ocean he'd dreamed about as a child in Hopkinsville. Something about being near water felt right. They rented a house on Arctic Crescent, a modest home that served as both residence and office. Gladys came with them, continuing her role as primary stenographer. The association was officially incorporated, with a small board of directors and the goal of preserving every reading for future research. The work intensified. 2 readings a day, nearly every day. The files grew thicker. The documented cases numbered in the thousands. People came from across the country now, sometimes from overseas, seeking readings for conditions doctors couldn't solve. Edgar's reputation had spread far beyond Kentucky and Ohio. Magazine articles appeared. Books were written about him. He was the sleeping prophet, the miracle man of Virginia Beach, America's most mysterious man. He hated the sensationalism. He wasn't mysterious, just ordinary. He wasn't performing miracles, just channeling information from somewhere else. The publicity brought more people seeking help, which was good. but it also brought more skeptics, more attacks, more accusations of fraud. The American Medical Association investigated him multiple times. They couldn't find evidence of fraud, but they also couldn't accept that an uneducated man could diagnose conditions accurately without examining patients. Their reports were grudgingly neutral, which satisfied no one. Scientists occasionally studied him. A few came away convinced something genuine was happening. Most left baffled but unwilling to stake their professional reputations on something so far outside accepted paradigms. Through it all, Edgar kept giving readings. The content continued expanding into new territories. Life readings, as the reincarnation-focused sessions were called, became as common as health readings. People wanted to understand their life purpose, their karmic patterns, their soul's journey across multiple incarnations. The readings described a universe operating according to laws Edgar had never imagined. Karma wasn't punishment, but education. Earth was a school where souls chose to incarnate to learn specific lessons. Free will was absolute. You could ignore your lessons and repeat them again in future lives, or embrace them and graduate to higher levels of existence. The readings spoke about other dimensions, other planets that served as classrooms for souls at different stages of development. They described a cosmic system of spiritual evolution that made Edgar's simple Baptist theology look like kindergarten material. Most disturbing to Edgar were readings that described Jesus not as the unique Son of God, but as an advanced soul who'd perfected himself across many lifetimes, ultimately becoming the Christ, a pattern that all souls were meant to follow. This felt like blasphemy, yet the readings insisted they were honouring Christ, not diminishing him. He was the example, the way shower, the pattern of perfection. But the goal was for everyone to achieve Christ consciousness, not to worship from a distance. Edgar struggled with this for years. He never fully resolved it, but he kept giving readings because people kept being helped. Whatever theological problems he had with the content, the practical results were undeniable. A woman with cancer followed a reading's recommendations and went into remission. A child with epilepsy received a treatment protocol that stopped the seizures. A man on the verge of bankruptcy got business advice that saved his company. A couple on the brink of divorce received insights into karmic patterns that helped them understand and forgive each other. The readings worked. That was what mattered. Edgar could wrestle with the philosophy in private. In public, he'd keep being the channel. By 1929, the organisation had grown beyond the small house on Arctic Crescent. They needed a proper headquarters, a place designed specifically for the work. Supporters rallied. Donations came in. By 1930, construction began on a building that would house the library, office space, and a dedicated reading room. The stock market crash of 1929 hit them hard, as it hit everyone. Promised donations evaporated. Construction stopped and started multiple times as funds appeared and disappeared. But eventually, through sheer persistence, the building was completed. The Association for Research and Enlightenment had a home. The readings had a permanent archive. Edgar's work, which had started in a photography studio in Bowling Green, now had an institutional foundation that might outlast him. He was in his 50s now. The years of twice-daily readings were taking their toll. He was tired more often. He needed longer recovery periods between sessions. But people kept asking for help, and Edgar had never learned how to say no. The 1930s brought a new kind of pressure. The Depression had devastated America. Desperate people wrote to Edgar from everywhere, begging for readings they couldn't afford. He wanted to help them all. The readings said he should limit himself to 2 sessions per day to preserve his health. Edgar ignored this advice constantly. He'd do 3, 4, sometimes 5 readings in a single day when the letters got too heartbreaking to refuse. His body paid the price. He developed headaches that wouldn't quit. His voice grew hoarse. He lost weight he couldn't afford to lose. Gertrude begged him to slow down. Hugh Lynn pleaded with him. The readings themselves warned him repeatedly that he was burning out his physical vehicle, but Edgar would read another desperate letter from a mother whose child was dying, and he'd schedule another reading. How could he refuse? The work continued expanding in directions nobody anticipated. In 1933, a reading mentioned something that would become central to the entire body of material. Atlantis, the lost continent described by Plato, became a recurring theme. According to the readings, Atlantis hadn't been myth, but history, an advanced civilization that had existed for thousands of years before destroying itself through misuse of powerful technologies. The readings described 3 periods of destruction, the final one around 10,000 BC, sending the continent beneath the Atlantic Ocean. Survivors had fled to Egypt, to Central America, to other parts of the world, carrying fragments of their knowledge. This explained, the readings claimed, why similar pyramids appeared in Egypt and Mexico, why ancient civilizations seemed to possess advanced astronomical knowledge, why legends of a great flood existed in cultures across the globe. Many souls currently incarnate, the reading said, had lived in Atlantis. Their present life challenges often related to lessons unlearned from that time. Someone struggling with power in this life might have misused it in Atlantis. Someone drawn to healing might have been a temple healer there. The karmic patterns were playing out across millennia. Edgar found this material both fascinating and troubling. There was no way to verify any of it. No archaeological evidence for Atlantis existed. Yet the readings spoke about it with the same confidence they brought to medical cases that could be verified. If the medical information proved accurate, did that mean the Atlantis material was also true? Or was something else happening? Some mixture of genuine psychic information and Edgar's own unconscious imagination? He didn't know, but the people who received these readings found them helpful. That was what mattered. A businessman who learned he'd been a corrupt Atlantean priest understood his current struggles with ethical shortcuts. A woman who discovered she'd been a healer in Atlantis felt called to pursue nursing. The information, whether literally true or symbolically accurate, was transforming lives. Then came the prophecies. Throughout the 1930s, readings began making specific predictions about world events. In 1935, readings warned about coming upheaval in Europe. They predicted a second world war before the first was even a distant memory for most Americans. They described the rise of dictatorships, the persecution of specific groups, the alignment of nations that wouldn't become obvious for years. In 1936, a reading predicted that in 1938 there would be upheavals in America related to internal conditions. The recession of 1938 proved them right. Other readings spoke about Earth changes, geological shifts that would reshape coastlines. They predicted that portions of California would slide into the ocean, that new land would rise in the Atlantic, that the Great Lakes would eventually empty into the Gulf of Mexico. These predictions were given specific time frames. Most pointed toward the period between 1958 and 1998. Edgar hated the prophecy readings. They brought the wrong kin of attention, sensationalists who ignored the health readings and the life readings, and the spiritual philosophy would fixate on predictions of disaster. Newspapers loved catastrophe. They didn't care about someone being healed. They wanted headlines about California falling into the sea. The predictions also raised an uncomfortable question. If the readings could be wrong about prophecy, what else might they be wrong about? Not all the predictions came true. Some events happened, but not on the predicted timeline. Others seemed metaphorical rather than literal. The readings themselves eventually addressed this, explaining that prophecy was probability based on current patterns, not fixed destiny. Human free will could change outcomes. Collective consciousness could shift timelines. This made sense philosophically, but didn't help Edgar's credibility when skeptics pointed to failed predictions. He'd rather have stuck to health readings, where results were immediate and verifiable. But the readings had their own agenda, and Edgar had learned long ago that he wasn't in control. The late 1930s brought another development that would shape the work's legacy. A young woman named Gladys Davis had joined as Edgar's secretary in 1923. For years she'd been transcribing the readings, maintaining the files, managing the correspondence. She was efficient, dedicated, and completely reliable. By the late 30s, Gladys had become the institutional memory of the entire operation. She knew the readings better than anyone except perhaps Hugh Lynn. She could cross-reference topics, find Patty, urns, connect information from readings given years apart. Her filing system turned thousands of individual readings into a searchable database. When someone asked if the readings had ever addressed a specific topic, Gladys could locate every relevant reference within minutes. This organizational work was crucial. Without it, the readings would have been just a pile of transcripts. Gladys transformed them into a body of knowledge that could be studied, analysed, and applied. She never sought credit. She worked in the background, making everyone else's work possible. But anyone who spent time at the association knew that Gladys was the backbone holding everything together. Edgar's health continued declining through the late 30s. He was in his 60s now, and the years of strain were accumulating. The readings kept warning him. They'd say he needed complete rest, needed to stop giving readings for weeks or months at a time. He'd try. He'd manage a few days, maybe a week. Then another desperate letter would arrive, and he'd schedule another reading. Gertrude had developed her own health problems. Years of managing the household, dealing with financial insecurity, and worrying about Edgar had worn her down. She needed readings herself now, and they helped. But the irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who could diagnose strangers across a continent couldn't heal his own wife without going into trance. Hugh Lynn had become essential to the operation. He'd grown into a serious student of the material, giving lectures, writing articles, helping people understand the philosophical framework underlying the readings. He'd married and started a family. He was building his own life while remaining deeply committed to his father's work. The relationship between father and son was complex. Hugh Lynn believed in the readings completely. He'd seen too much to doubt them, but he also saw his father's limitations, saw the toll the work was taking, saw the organisational challenges that Edgar either couldn't or wouldn't address. There was love there, deep love, but also frustration on both sides. Edgar felt Hugh Lynn sometimes pushed too hard, tried to institutionalise something that was fundamentally personal. Hugh Lynn felt Edgar was too passive, too willing to let others take advantage of him, too reluctant to say no. They worked through it. They had to. The work was bigger than their personal dynamics. Then in 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. The world Edgar had known was ending. The prophecies about war were coming true. Within months, Europe was engulfed in conflict. By 1940, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. Americans watched nervously, most hoping to stay out of another European war. The readings had seen it coming. That didn't make it easier to witness. Requests for readings intensified. People wanted to know if America would enter the war. Mothers asked if their sons would be drafted, if they'd survive if they were. Business owners wanted advice on how to prepare for wartime economy. Everyone was scared. Edgar did what he always did. He gave readings, too many readings. His health deteriorated further. The warnings became more urgent. He'd shed the physical body beyond its limits. He needed months of complete rest or the vehicle wouldn't last. He couldn't rest. Not with the world falling apart. Not with people begging for help. Not when he'd been given this gift specifically to serve others. How could he stop now? December 1941 brought Pearl Harbor. America was at war. Young men who'd been sitting for readings months earlier were now in uniform, shipping out to battlefields, in Europe and the Pacific. The letters to Edgar changed. Now they came from training camps, from ships at sea, from military bases. Soldiers wanted to know if they'd survive, wanted to understand the spiritual meaning of what they were facing, wanted reassurance that death, if it came, wasn't the end. Edgar answered as best he could. The readings spoke out the war in spiritual terms. This was a necessary confrontation with forces that had aligned themselves against human freedom and spiritual development. The souls fighting in this war had chosen to incarnate at this time for this purpose. Those who died would reincarnate quickly, their sacrifice speeding their spiritual evolution. Victory was certain, though the cost would be high. It wasn't the kind of information you'd find in newspaper coverage of the war, but it helped people find meaning in the chaos. That was what Edgar had always done, given people a framework for understanding their suffering, a reason to keep going. The war years were exhausting. Edgar's reading schedule became impossible. 3, 4, 5, sometimes 6 readings per day. Letters came from everywhere. Mothers, desperate to know if their sons would survive. Wives seeking reassurance about husbands overseas. The wounded looking for healing protocols. He couldn't say no to any of them. Gertrude tried to protect him. Gladys tried to limit the schedule. Hugh Lynn, now in the army himself, wrote letters begging his father to slow down. Edgar kept pushing. By 1944, he was giving 8 readings some days. The readings themselves had become urgent in their warnings. The body couldn't sustain this pace. The channel was wearing out. Rest immediately or face consequences. Edgar heard them. He understood. He kept going anyway. He'd been given this gift to help people. People were dying in a war. How could he rest while they suffered? In September 1944, he collapsed. Not during a reading, but after one. He stood up from the couch where he'd been lying, took 2 steps, and crumpled. Gertrude called for help. The local doctor examined him and prescribed complete bed rest. No more readings, not for weeks, possibly months. Edgar agreed. He had no choice. His body had quit. For the first time in decades, the reading schedule stopped completely. No sessions at all. The office stopped taking requests. Gladys sent letters explaining the situation. Edgar lay in bed, trying to recover strength that had been depleted over years. But the damage was deeper than anyone realized. The vehicle that had served as channel for 43 years was breaking down. The readings that had warned him so many times had been right. He'd pushed too far, and now the bill was coming due. The stroke came in January 1945. Edgar woke that morning unable to move his left side. Gertrude found him struggling to get out of bed, one half of his body simply refusing commands. The local doctor confirmed what everyone feared: a cerebral hemorrhage, significant damage, recovery uncertain. They moved Edgar to a hospital in Virginia Beach. Better facilities, specialists who might help. The prognosis wasn't good. At 67, after decades of depleting his physical energy through the readings, Edgar's body had finally given out completely. He could speak, though with difficulty. His mind remained clear, but the paralysis wouldn't lift. The left side of his body had gone offline, and no amount of prayer or medical intervention seemed able to bring it back. Gertrude stayed at his bedside. Gladys visited daily. Hugh Lynn, still in the army, requested emergency leave and made it home just in time. The 3 of them kept vigil while Edgar drifted in and out of consciousness. During his lucid moments, he talked about the work, not with regret about what he'd done to himself, but with concern about what would happen to the information. The readings numbered in the thousands now. All those transcripts, all that knowledge. Someone had to make sense of it. Someone had to continue studying the patterns. Gladys promised they would. The Association for Research and Enlightenment would preserve everything. The readings would be studied, organized, made available to researchers. Nothing would be lost. Edgar seemed satisfied with that. He'd done what he came to do, given people access to information that might help them understand themselves and their place in the universe. Whether the medical establishment ever accepted it didn't matter. The work existed. It would find the people who needed it. On January 3rd, his condition worsened. The doctors said there was nothing more they could do. They sent him home to die. Gertrude set up a hospital bed in their bedroom, the same room where he'd given thousands of readings over the years. The same couch was still there, though he'd never lie on it again. Edgar spent his final days in that room, surrounded by the tools of the work that had consumed his life. He died on January 3rd, 1945, late in the evening. Gertrude was holding his hand. Gladys and Hugh Lynn were in the room. He opened his eyes once near the end, looked at each of them, and closed them again. Then he was gone. The man who'd spent 43 years channeling information about healing and the soul had completed his own journey. Whatever happened next would prove or disprove everything the readings had said about life after death. Gertrude followed him 3 months later. She'd held on through Edgar's final illness, stayed strong while he needed her. But once he was gone, she had nothing left to give. The strain of those last years, watching him destroy himself while being unable to stop it, had broken something in her. She developed pneumonia in March. It progressed rapidly. On Easter Sunday, April 1st, 1945, Gertrude Cayce died in the same bedroom where Edgar had passed away 3 months earlier. They were buried together in Riverside Cemetery in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. Back where the story had started, in the small town where a young man had first discovered he could do something no one could explain. The obituaries were brief. Edgar Cayce, local psychic, dies at 67, survived by his wife Gertrude and sons Hugh Lynn and Edgar Evans, known for medical readings conducted while in trance state. The newspapers didn't mention the 14,000 readings, didn't discuss the philosophy of reincarnation and soul development that had emerged from them, didn't acknowledge the thousands of people whose lives had been changed by contact with this uneducated man who somehow knew things he shouldn't. To the wider world, Edgar Cayce was a curiosity who died, another in a long line of psychics and mystics who'd made claims that couldn't be verified. The story should have ended there. It didn't. Hugh Lynn had spent years preparing for this moment. He'd known his father couldn't continue forever. He'd watched the work nearly destroy the family multiple times. He'd seen the exploitation, the skepticism, the constant struggle for legitimacy. But he'd also read the transcripts, thousands of them. He'd seen patterns that couldn't be explained by chance. He'd witnessed healings that defied medical explanation. He'd talked to people whose lives had been transformed by information his father had provided. The work was real, imperfect, complicated, often frustrating, but real, and it deserved to be preserved, studied, understood. So Hugh Lynn dedicated the rest of his life to exactly that. He took over the Association for Research and Enlightenment, transformed it from a small operation supporting his father's readings into a research organisation focused on studying the transcripts systematically. He hired researchers, established a library, created indexing systems so people could find readings on specific topics, opened the archives to scholars who wanted to study the material seriously. Most importantly, he protected the integrity of what his father had done. He didn't embellish, didn't add supernatural claims beyond what the readings actually said, didn't turn Edgar into something he wasn't. The transcripts spoke for themselves. Hugh Lynn's job was making sure people could access them. The work grew slowly but steadily. By the 1960s, the ARE had moved to Virginia Beach, built a headquarters, established educational programs. Thousands of people were studying the readings, trying to apply the principles to their own lives. Books started appearing, not written by Edgar, who'd never written anything except letters, but by researchers analysing the readings, medical protocols, philosophy, reincarnation case studies. The information his father had channeled was finally being organised into comprehensible form. Then in 1967, a writer named Jess Stern published a book called The Sleeping Prophet. It was a popular biography of Edgar Cayce, aimed at general readers rather than academics or true believers. The book became a massive bestseller. Suddenly everyone knew who Edgar Cayce was. The man who died in obscurity 22 years earlier became a household name. The ARE was flooded with requests for information. The readings that had been quietly studied by a small community were now being discussed on college campuses and in living rooms across America. This was both blessing and curse. The exposure brought resources, new researchers, broader interest in the material. But it also brought distortion. People who'd never read an actual transcript made claims about what Cayce had said. Legends grew. The careful, methodical man who'd spent his life trying to help people heal became a mystical prophet who'd predicted everything, from earthquakes to the end of the world. Hugh Lynn fought against this constantly. His father hadn't been a prophet. He'd been a channel for information, some of which proved accurate and some of which didn't. The readings were a resource for study, not scripture to be believed blindly. But controlling a narrative once it enters popular culture is impossible. Edgar Cayce became whatever people needed him to be: medical intuitive to some, spiritual teacher to others, prophet of earth changes to those looking for apocalyptic predictions. The actual man, with all his contradictions and limitations, got lost in the mythology. The readings themselves survived intact. 14,000 transcripts, carefully preserved, indexed, and made available to anyone who wanted to study them seriously. That was Hugh Lynn's real achievement. He'd kept the work alive in usable form. Modern researchers have tried analysing the medical readings using contemporary frameworks. The results are mixed. Some recommendations align with current understanding of physiology and biochemistry. Others don't make sense with current models. A few suggested treatments that were later validated by mainstream research decades after Edgar's death. The philosophical material raises different questions. The cosmology described in the readings, with its emphasis on soul development through multiple lifetimes, its explanation of karma as cause and effect rather than punishment, its insistence that every soul is divine and working toward reunion with the Creator. This framework resonated with millions of people searching for meaning beyond traditional religion. Was it true? That depends on what truth means when discussing spiritual matters that can't be empirically verified. The readings provided a coherent philosophy that helped people make sense of suffering, understand their relationships, and find purpose in their lives. Whether that philosophy reflects objective metaphysical reality or simply offers useful psychological frameworks is a question each person has to answer for themselves. What's undeniable is the impact. Edgar Cayce's work influenced the development of holistic medicine, contributed to the popularization of reincarnation in Western culture, and helped establish the legitimacy of mind-body approaches to health that were considered fringe during his lifetime but are now mainstream. The medical establishment still doesn't know what to make of him. The readings contain too many accurate diagnoses made without medical training to dismiss completely. But the theoretical framework, with its talk of karma and past lives and spiritual causes of disease, doesn't fit within materialist models of medicine. So Edgar Cayce occupies a strange space, too credible to ignore entirely, too unorthodox to accept fully. His work sits in that uncomfortable zone where the evidence suggests something real was happening, but the explanations available violate too many assumptions about how reality works. Maybe that's appropriate. Edgar himself never claimed to understand the gift. He just used it as best he could, helped the people who came to him, and left behind a record that others could study. The small house in Virginia Beach where he gave his final readings is now a museum. You can tour the rooms where the Cayce family lived, see the couch where Edgar lay during sessions. Examine the stenographer's desk where Gladys recorded the information. The Association for Research and Enlightenment still operates across the street. The library holds all 14,000 reading transcripts, along with mountains of correspondence and research accumulated over 8 decades. Scholars come from around the world to study the material, and people still write letters. Not to Edgar, obviously, but to the organisation he left behind. Letters from people dealing with medical conditions. Mainstream medicine can't solve. Letters from spiritual seekers looking for frameworks to understand their experiences. Letters from skeptics demanding proof. Letters from believers sharing testimonials. The same mix of desperation, hope, curiosity, and devotion that drove people to a small house in Kentucky a century ago still drives them to Virginia Beach today. What Edgar Cayce proved, if he proved anything, is that human consciousness contains depths we don't understand, that the line between normal and paranormal might be more permeable than we assume, that healing involves factors beyond the purely physical, that each life is part of a larger story we can't fully see. Or maybe he proved nothing except that a kind man with an unexplainable gift spent his life trying to help people, and that effort mattered regardless of whether anyone could explain how it worked. The readings themselves offer one final perspective on Edgar's life and work. In one of the last sessions before his collapse, someone asked about the source of the information he provided. Where did it come from? Was it his subconscious mind, universal consciousness, divine revelation, spirit guides? The answer was characteristically unhelpful. All of those and none of those. The labels humans use to categorize spiritual phenomena are too limited to capture what actually happens when consciousness expands beyond normal boundaries. The information comes from wherever all information comes from. The channel matters less than whether the information helps people grow. Edgar Cayce died not knowing if any of it was real. He had to take on faith that the gift was genuine, that the information helped people, that his life of service meant something beyond the suffering it caused his family and himself. That's the paradox at the heart of Edgar Cayce's legacy. A man who helped thousands while doubting himself. A gift that demanded everything while explaining nothing. A life lived in service to something he couldn't prove was real. And maybe that's the most important lesson his story offers. Not the medical readings or the spiritual philosophies or the prophecies, but the example of someone who kept helping people, even when he didn't understand. How, even when it cost him dearly, even when the world called him fraud or saint with equal conviction. Consider what it must have been like. To wake up every morning knowing you possessed something extraordinary but unexplainable. To face people desperate for help, knowing you might be able to provide it but having no idea why it worked. To watch your family sacrifice normal life so you could serve strangers. To endure skepticism and mockery from those who called you charlatan while simultaneously dealing with true believers who wanted you to be something more than human. Edgar handled it with remarkable humility. He never claimed to be special, never pretended to understand the mechanics of his gift, never tried to build an empire or accumulate followers like other psychics of his era. He just gave the readings, helped when he could, and went back to his photography studio or his garden or his Sunday school class. That ordinariness might be the strangest thing about him. Here was someone doing things that shouldn't be possible, and he treated it like a job. Showed up, did the work, went home. No mystical airs, no elaborate rituals. Just lie down, go to sleep, wake up, repeat. The medical establishment's response to Cayce reveals how institutions handle phenomena that don't fit their models. Ignore when possible, dismiss when necessary. Occasionally, acknowledge but only in ways that preserve existing frameworks. A few doctors over the years quietly admitted that something unusual was happening. But institutional medicine couldn't accommodate a Kentucky photographer who diagnosed disease while unconscious. So the work remained marginal, studied by believers and curiosity seekers rather than integrated into mainstream practice, which raises uncomfortable questions. How much genuine knowledge gets dismissed because it arrives through unacceptable channels? How many potentially valuable insights are lost because they threaten established paradigms? If Edgar's medical information helped people, does it matter that we can't explain the mechanism? Science would say yes, the mechanism matters. Understanding how something works is inseparable from knowing whether it actually works. Without a theoretical framework, apparent successes might be coincidence, placebo effect, or misattribution. Fair point. But the people who recovered after following Edgar's suggestions probably didn't care much about theoretical frameworks. They cared about results. This tension between epistemology and pragmatism runs through the entire Cayce story. Scholars and skeptics focus on whether the gift was real. Patients and families focus on whether the treatments worked. Different questions requiring different standards of evidence. The prophecy problem complicates everything further. Some predictions came true in ways that seem impossible to explain by chance. Others failed spectacularly. The mix makes it difficult to draw conclusions. If Edgar had been purely fraudulent, you'd expect consistent failure or vague statements that could be retrofitted to any outcome. If he'd been genuinely psychic in some consistent way, you'd expect better accuracy. Instead, you get this messy middle ground, where enough hits exist to demand explanation, but enough misses exist to prevent confident conclusions. Maybe consciousness itself is messy in ways we don't yet grasp. Maybe accessing information outside normal sensory channels is possible but unreliable. Maybe the gift was real but imperfect, influenced by Edgar's own beliefs and limitations, filtered through language inadequate to capture what he was perceiving. Or maybe it was all suggestion and lucky guesses, and the human tendency to remember hits while forgetting misses. That explanation is simpler, requires no revision of our understanding of reality, and fits within materialist frameworks that have proven extraordinarily useful for understanding the world. But then you have to explain the medical cases, the diagnoses made without examining the patient, the treatments prescribed using terminology Edgar had never encountered while awake, the outcomes that mainstream medicine couldn't provide. Not all of them, not even most, but enough to create a problem for simple dismissal. David Kahn, Edgar's biographer and early collaborator, spent years trying to verify the readings. He investigated hundreds of cases, interviewed patients, examined medical records. His conclusion was careful. Something genuine appeared to be happening, but the nature of that something remained unclear. The information Edgar provided often proved accurate and helpful. Whether this resulted from psychic ability, accessing some universal information field, or some other mechanism, Kahn couldn't determine, but he became convinced the phenomenon was real, whatever its explanation. Gladys Davis, the stenographer who recorded nearly every reading for decades, never doubted Edgar's sincerity. She saw him give readings in circumstances that made fraud impossible. She watched him struggle with the gift's demands. She transcribed information he couldn't possibly have known. Her faith in Edgar remained unshaken until her death. But faith isn't evidence, and sincerity doesn't prove accuracy. A true believer's testimony, however detailed, can't substitute for rigorous investigation. The ARE continues that investigation today. Modern researchers apply contemporary methods to the historical record, looking for patterns, testing hypotheses, seeking frameworks that might explain the unexplainable. Some focus on the medical readings, comparing Edgar's recommendations to current understanding. Others explore the spiritual teachings, examining how they align with or diverge from various wisdom traditions. Still others approach it as historical curiosity, studying Edgar as a cultural phenomenon regardless of whether the gift was genuine. This multiplicity of approaches might be the healthiest response. No single lens captures the whole story. The medical researcher sees one thing, the spiritual seeker another, the skeptical historian something else entirely. Each perspective reveals certain truths while obscuring others. What remains inarguable is that Edgar Cayce affected thousands of lives. People came to him desperate and left with hope. Sometimes that hope proved justified, sometimes not. But the willingness to help, the commitment to service, the refusal to profit beyond basic needs, these qualities earned him loyalty and affection from those who knew him. His children paid a price. Growing up in that household meant dealing with constant interruptions, financial instability, and the weight of other people's expectations. Hugh Lynn eventually made peace with his father's legacy and spent his life continuing the work. But the strain on the family was real and lasting. Gertrude remained devoted until the end, but that devotion cost her. The stress of managing Edgar's health, dealing with the constant demands, maintaining the household while her husband exhausted himself helping strangers, it wore her down. She developed her own health problems, some of which Edgar's readings addressed with mixed success. The healer's wife needed healing, and even the gift couldn't always provide it. The final years were difficult. Edgar knew he was dying. The readings told him so. He'd given too many sessions, depleted his resources, and his body was shutting down. He could have stopped earlier. Should have, probably. But people kept asking for help, and he kept saying yes, right until the end. That choice defines his legacy more than any particular reading or prophecy. The decision to keep serving even knowing it would kill him. Whether the gift was real or imagined, psychic ability or elaborate self-deception, Edgar Cayce believed he was helping people and couldn't refuse them while he still had strength. There's something deeply human about that, something that transcends questions of paranormal ability or spiritual truth. A person who wore himself out trying to ease others' suffering. A person who maintained humility in the face of extraordinary claims. A person who kept showing up even when exhausted, even when doubted, even when the cost became unbearable. The house in Virginia Beach where Edgar died is quiet now. Tourists walk through, look at the preserved rooms, listen to guides explain the history. The couch where he gave readings sits behind velvet ropes. The stenographer's desk holds Gladys's old typewriter. The walls display photographs from different eras of his life. It feels strange seeing those ordinary spaces where extraordinary claims were made. The domesticity of it, the smallness. You expect something grander for a legacy this controversial and enduring. But Edgar's life was never grand. It was daily service performed in modest circumstances by someone who never wanted fame or fortune. The library across the street hold those 14,000 transcripts, row after row of filing cabinets containing decades of readings, each one a window into someone's crisis, someone's hope, someone's desperation, each one a record of Edgar trying to help, whether he understood how or not. Researchers still study them, seekers still reference them, critics still dismiss them. The debate continues because the evidence remains ambiguous, clear enough to prevent simple dismissal, messy enough to prevent confident endorsement, perfect territory for endless argument. But arguments miss the point. The point is that Edgar Cayce spent his life in service to something larger than himself. Whether that something was divine gift, subconscious ability, or elaborate self-deception, he helped when he could, admitted limits when he couldn't, and never claimed to be more than he was. That's rare, especially in circles where extraordinary claims are common currency. Edgar could have built an empire, could have charged wealthy clients enormous sums, could have cultivated an image of mystical authority. He did none of those things. He remained a photographer from Kentucky who sometimes gave psychic readings, treated it as work rather than spiritual theatre, and went home to his family when the session ended. The medical readings, the prophecies, the spiritual teachings, all of it matters less than that basic integrity. Whether you believe the gift was real or think the whole thing was unconscious fraud, you have to acknowledge that Edgar Cayce lived with unusual consistency between claimed values and actual behaviour. He said the readings told him to help people without concern for payment, so he helped people regardless of whether they could pay. He said the gift was meant for service, not profit, so he refused opportunities for wealth. He said healing came from addressing spiritual causes, not just physical symptoms. So he approached each person as a whole being, not just a collection of symptoms. That coherence between teaching and living is uncommon. Most people compromise, rationalize, find exceptions to their stated principles. Edgar maintained his until the gift killed him. You can debate whether that was wisdom or foolishness, but you can't question his commitment. The letters still arrive. People facing medical mysteries, spiritual crises, questions about life and death and meaning. They write seeking answers Edgar gave decades ago, hoping those words might apply to their circumstances. Sometimes they find help in the old readings, sometimes not. But the impulse that drove people to Kentucky in 1910 still drives them to Virginia Beach today. The hope that somewhere, somehow, answers exist beyond what mainstream institutions provide. Edgar Cayce proved nothing definitively, but he demonstrated something important. That dedication to service matters regardless of whether the service comes through normal or paranormal means. That humility in the face of extraordinary claims is possible. That you can live with mystery without pretending to have certainty. That helping people is its own justification, even when you can't explain how or why your help works. The sleeping prophet is gone. The readings remain. Make of them what you will. But remember the man who gave them. Not as saint or charlatan, but as someone who tried his best with a gift he never fully understood. Helped when he could, admitted limits when he couldn't, and kept showing up until he had nothing left to give. 80 years after his death, what do we actually know? A man could diagnose illness while unconscious. Thousands of documented cases, medical terminology he'd never studied, treatments that worked when conventional medicine failed. That part is verifiable. The rest gets complicated. The reincarnation material, the Atlantis stories, the cosmic philosophy about souls evolving across lifetimes. None of that can be proven or disproven. It either resonates or it doesn't. It helps people make sense of their lives, or it seems like elaborate mythology. Your worldview determines which. But here's what separates Edgar Cayce from every other psychic, medium, and spiritual teacher of his era. He never wanted the attention, never claimed to understand what was happening, never built a fortune or a cult or an empire. Just gave the readings, helped who he could, and went back to his regular life. Most people with unexplainable abilities leverage them. They perform, they mystify, they cultivate an image of otherworldly wisdom. Edgar took photographs and taught Sunday school. The ordinariness was the strangest thing about him. The gift destroyed him. That's not metaphor. 43 years of twice daily readings depleted something essential. The warnings came through his own sleeping voice. Rest or die. He chose to keep working, not from ego or ambition, from inability to refuse people who asked for help. That decision cost him everything. His health, his wife's health, years he could have spent with family, a normal old age. He traded all of it for the chance to help strangers he'd never meet, using abilities he'd never understand. Whether the gift came from God or his subconscious, or some universal information field, doesn't change the basic arithmetic. A man gave his life helping people. The mechanism matters less than the commitment. The readings themselves offer one final perspective that feels appropriate as we end this story. Someone once asked the sleeping Edgar, what happens after death? The answer was simple. You wake up. The long dream of physical existence ends, and consciousness continues in forms we can't perceive from this side. Edgar woke up on January 3rd, 1945. Found out if any of it was real. Discovered whether the soul actually does return, again and again, learning lessons across centuries. Learned if Atlantis existed, if karma operates the way the readings described, if the universe really is structured the way that Sleeping Voice insisted, or maybe death was exactly what materialists claim, the end of consciousness, the final silence, in which case Edgar Cayce spent 43 years channeling his own unconscious imagination, accidentally helping people through a mechanism psychology hasn't figured out yet. We don't get to know, not while we're here. That's the central frustration and the central lesson of Edgar's entire story. We live in mystery. We make choices without certainty. We help when we can, doubt ourselves constantly, and never get definitive proof that any of it matters. Edgar did it anyway. Helped people despite doubts, maintained integrity despite opportunities to profit, kept working despite exhaustion and criticism and the toll on his family. Not because he knew he was right, because he believed helping people was worth doing even if he couldn't explain how it worked. That might be the real gift, not the medical diagnoses or the prophecies or the spiritual teachings. The gift of showing up consistently in service to something larger than yourself, maintaining humility while making extraordinary claims, and refusing to quit even when quitting would have been completely justified. The 14,000 transcripts sit in that library in Virginia Beach, physical evidence of decades spent trying to help. Some of those readings were accurate beyond explanation. Some were wrong. Most fall somewhere in between, useful to some people, meaningless to others, impossible to evaluate definitively. Edgar Cayce never asked anyone to believe in him, just offered what came through and let people decide for themselves. That restraint, that refusal to demand faith or loyalty, might be the most remarkable thing about his entire life. He could have been a guru. He remained a photographer who sometimes gave readings. The story doesn't end with answers. It ends with more questions. About consciousness, about healing, about the nature of reality itself. Edgar Cayce's life and work forced those questions into the open, not by proving anything conclusively, but by demonstrating that our current models can't explain everything we observe. Maybe that's enough, not proof of the supernatural, but proof that the natural is stranger than we assume. Not evidence of life after death, but evidence that life before death contains depths we're only beginning to explore. The sleeping prophet is gone, but the questions he raised remain. About what consciousness can do when it moves beyond normal boundaries, about whether healing requires more than physical intervention, about whether each life is isolated or part of something larger, about whether meaning exists in the universe or whether we create it ourselves through the stories we tell. Edgar Cayce told a story about a simple man given an impossible gift, using it as best he could, despite never understanding it, helping people until the gift consumed him. Whether that story is literally true, in every detail matters less than whether it helps you think about your own life differently. That was always the point of the readings, not to provide absolute truth, but to offer frameworks that might help people grow. Edgar himself said it best through that sleeping voice. The information matters less than what you do with it. The source matters less than whether it helps you become more compassionate, more aware, more willing to serve something beyond yourself. He lived that philosophy completely, never claimed special knowledge while awake, never demanded recognition, never stopped working despite the cost, just showed up every day, lay down on that couch, and tried to help one more person. The gift was real, or it wasn't. The readings were accurate, or they weren't. Edgar Cayce was channeling universal wisdom, or channeling his own unconscious. We'll argue about it forever because the evidence won't let us settle it definitively. But the life was real, the service was real, the commitment was real. A man who could have done anything with an unexplainable ability chose to help people heal, chose to maintain humility, chose to keep going until there was nothing left. That choice echoes across decades, not because it proved anything about the paranormal, but because it proves something about what humans are capable of when they dedicate themselves completely to serving others. Edgar Cayce died not knowing if any of it mattered. We don't know either. But maybe the not knowing is the point. Maybe faith isn't believing despite lack of evidence. Maybe it's helping despite lack of certainty. Maybe it's showing up consistently, even when you can't prove your work makes a difference. The readings are still there. 14,000 sessions worth of information, available to anyone curious enough to study them seriously. Some will find wisdom that changes their lives. Others will find nothing but outdated medical advice and spiritual speculation. Both responses are valid. Edgar never claimed otherwise. What he claimed, or what claimed to speak through him, was that every life has purpose, that consciousness survives death, that the universe operates according to spiritual laws as precise as physical laws, that love and service matter more than success and recognition, that we're all on a journey toward understanding, and that journey continues across lifetimes until we finally get it right. Beautiful philosophy, impossible to verify, helpful to millions, meaningless to millions more. The man who channeled it spent his life in service to something he couldn't prove was real. That's either the most foolish thing a person can do or the most courageous. Probably both. Edgar Cayce was nobody special, just a photographer from Kentucky who talked to invisible people as a child, slept on spelling books as a teenager, lost his voice as a young man, and discovered he could diagnose illness while unconscious. None of that should have been possible. All of it happened anyway. He helped people until the gift killed him. Left behind questions we still can't answer. Demonstrated that consciousness contains possibilities we haven't mapped. Lived with integrity while making claims that would have destroyed anyone less humble. The sleeping prophet is gone. The mystery remains. Make of it what you will.